what happened was that they dragged us through this appalling thing. They confiscated my passport. And by the one great silver lining was Paul McCartney rung at the Hilton Hotel where we'd taken refuge, Brian Jones and I. And he said, they're going to try and arrest you again. So I'm sending my car and my driver to pick you up and your luggage. You're coming to stay with me. And if they want to arrest you, they'll have to arrest me as well. And, you know, McCartney, MBE, you know, the Beatles, with the power of the Beatles was like, you know, they would think twice about it. So I lived several weeks with Paul McCartney and, you know, worked with the Beatles and, you know, because the circumstances made me a protege of the band, as it were. And so it was a very enriching experience.
Hey, everybody, like what you see, Luxe Life with Candice Bar or any of the Luxe Media Studios shows, make sure you subscribe and click the like below. Hey, everybody, welcome to Luxe Life with Candice Bar. We are so excited for today. We have Prince Stash on with us today. So I kind of want to go, I love starting from the beginning. The beginning is always a good place to start. So for whatever reason, whoever may not know of you or who you are, can you kind of give people a background? Where are you from?
I'm not from anywhere. That's the odd thing. I was born, we have to, if we really want to go back to the beginning, I come from a very ancient family in realms that no longer exist. My grandparents found themselves in at university in what was then called Breslau in Upper Silesia, which was part of Oriental Prussia. So they were Polish, but there was no longer Poland, so you couldn't be Polish. So they were German citizens, as it were, and they eloped because their families were against this match. A researcher found their marriage certificate in 1904 in London. So they went from London to Paris, where they lived a very affluent life with many art. They were both artists. They were both collectors. They had money and all that, and so they lived very well in with a coterie of famous artists, and everything went well until World War One. My uncle was born in 1905. My father was to become super famous. Both of them were quite famous people, but they were born respectively in 1905, 1908, but didn't become French until their late teens. And so I was born. By then, wherever you're born, if you're the son of a citizen of France, you are French automatically. My son, for instance, who was born in America, doesn't really speak French at all, also has a French passport. But that wasn't the case at the beginning of the 20th century. So I would have been born in Paris, where my parents intended to live, but the World War II intervened, and my father and mother went first to a region of the Savoy, which was in the free zone, and then my mother had to look after her father, who was, and when she was pregnant with me, so in 1942, and then my grandfather died, and I was born in Switzerland. But I never associated, despite the fact that my mother comes from this very grand, aristocratic Swiss family among the founders of the capital, and, you know, going back to the 10th century in a straight line. On my so I come from these shadow lands, and the beauty of it was that I never identified with nationality, with culturally. I was a European, and I didn't speak English, for instance, until I was practically 16.
Wow.
I mean, went to school in England, and eventually I had a tutor in England, and so I became Anglophone and continued in English-speaking schools in Switzerland, and then I went to Rome, and I was discovered by an assistant of Lupino Visconti at the height of the Dolce Vita period in Rome, as I was about to do my last year of American high school, which was a complete yawn because I'd had this very classics education, and all these programs were child's play. I thought these people are cretins, I mean, it was so boring. Fortunately, despite the fact that I'd promised to do all these things, my mother relieved her, said, no, you should do, they're offering you this contract, you should do it. And that's how I got out of it and found myself basically with Fellini at the 13th Cannes Film Festival and all such wonderful things. And my life became rather exciting. I was in Paris at a time when, there was a lot of great music there. The African American jazz musicians were there in great force, and I hobnobbed with them and learned a lot from those people, and had a chance to move in a milieu of bohemian writers. I used to meet, and people always made time for me, although I was just a kid, 17 or something. I used to spend hours talking to Man Ray and people like that. It was a sensational period to be there. And so I did a couple of films as an actor, and I was also learning technique and being an assistant director as well as acting in the same pictures. And I then got a chance to go to New York in 1962 at the end of the last couple months, 2-3 months of 1962. And I was taking acting lessons in New York and hobnobbing with a bunch of very interesting people. And I then decided that it was far too cold and took a Greyhound bus to LA, where I arrived armed with a letter from the famous French director Marc Allégret to Sam Goldwyn Jr. Sam Goldwyn Sam Goldwyn Jr. was the head of his father's studio on Formosa Avenue, a very famous story. And so I got a chance to learn lots of things as an honored guest, not as even today, a billionaire's son would be some lowly intern and would not be able to speak to the stars and to do all that. It was a completely different age in those days. And I was able to do things that are unthinkable in the 21st century. And then, I went from show to show, met people like Hitchcock, and wow. it was fascinating. I met all the great directors, the famous cinematographers, Joe Lachelle, Conrad Hall, Wexler, all those people. I met them all and was friendly with them all. And then I returned to France at the end of 63. And I couldn't find anything interesting to do. But I had a friend who was a very famous rock and roll star, Vince Taylor, who'd written by now one of the great classic rock and roll hits of all times, covered by so many people, Brand New Cadillac. And he said, well, you've always been in the music. Why don't you join the band? So I joined the band, became a percussionist, and I had, under the Beatles influence, which had taken in '64, I had grown my hair. I was one of the first people to grow my hair long, and because I was in this famous band, we ended up playing against the Rolling Stones. Against, I say, we weren't opening for the Rolling Stones. We were playing on a bill which had maybe 20, 30 other acts playing one song each, and we played our full set. Then there was an intermission. The Stones had to follow, which was not an easy task because we were really good and their fans were crazy about us.
Wow.
So, and we played an entire weekend, and that's how I became friends with Brian Jones, and through Brian Jones, Jimi Hendrix, and so on and so forth, And we had in our band a legendary drummer who was the first rock and roll drummer to play with twin bass drums. And all these guys, in famous bands, Ringo and Charlie Watts, people like that would come, and we'd spend nights, listening to jazz records and smoking joints in doing these sort of, listening parties, not just, it wasn't a background thing. We were into, one listened to music properly. And it's something that people just don't have a concept of because they're on their phones. They've got a zillion things going on at the same time. We didn't have that. We really listened to music. We really played music. It was a very different circumstance. We didn't have many distractions. There was hardly any TV, if any.
Actually paying attention.
Absolutely. And when with Jimi Hendrix, for instance, people are amazed because I always tell them when I met Jimi Hendrix for the first time, it was in this packed Brook Street apartment, and there were all these girls, all these musicians, and all night long, the same acetates of the soon-to-be released Are You Experienced by the Jimi Hendrix Experience was playing, and we were really, it was so wonderful because the musicians, it was a thrill for them to listen to how it had been captured on record. And for us who were listening to it, we could marvel at it. And so it was a mutual love of this. There was no jaded type of thing. Oh yeah, well, it was, and conversations going on. It was strictly being into the music, playing really loud, and that's the kind of thing. And so I hung. We were considered a bunch of freaks, so we really hung out with one another. I didn't, my friend Ken Rutkowski from Metal, he's amazed because he said, oh, but he's looking at a piece of paper where I wrote all these people. Those were the people I saw every day, whom I called every day. They all happened to be super, super famous, but that was how we lived. We saw each other every day. We talked to each other every day. And we spent nearly every evening together at some place or the other. As opposed to, we didn't have friends who were, who were God knows what, engineers or entrepreneurs. We didn't. That was the what we called the straight or square world. We didn't see those people. They didn't like us because their women liked us, and we didn't like them for sure.
Did you, going back to kind of, I guess, alchemy, kind of, let's use everyone loves this word, manifesting. Did you set up your life in such? Go ahead.
That was back in my teen years when, first of all, when I was a child, I had this very enchanted childhood in wonderful homes and so on. And it became something that was innate knowledge within me, that some statements that were made against the alchemical concepts, as a child, I just knew that those negative statements were wrong. How did I know? I don't know. No idea. It just came to me. This statement in this dictionary is completely incorrect. Later on, it was a very different thing, because in my teens I read a writer, a fantastic writer who influenced Franz Kafka and people like that, called Gustav Meyrink. And Gustav Meyrink wrote these extraordinary novels like The Golem, The Angel at the Western Window, which is all about alchemy and so on. And he was somebody who was, very famous before World War One. And I then developed an interest in what you would call occult literature, and I met certain people at key moments. So it was always at the back of my mind, and during those years, it was a wonderful foundation, especially when one got into psychedelic drugs and such things. It was a great thing to have some notions of these things, and then make a very long story short, in 1967, there were all these. The establishment wanted to decapitate the Rolling Stones, so they managed to get on these absurd charges. They were trying Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, and Brian Jones and I had gone. He persuaded me to follow him to Cannes, which I didn't want to do because I had to be in a film that John Huston was making with my then fiancée, Romina Power. And we would have been the perfect cast for this film. Unfortunately, I couldn't report for work because the Scotland Yard, the corrupt drug squad, tasked by the establishment to arrest Brian Jones, because if they could get the three Rolling Stones, send them to jail, the band, considered to be a menace to society, think about it, would be non-existent. Now they are pillars of the establishment.
Right.
Mick is Sir Michael, and all these things. I mean, it's ludicrous to think about it in those terms, but
right.
Back to 1967, they were hoping to throw the lot of us in jail. With me, they had a predicament because I was a titled person, and I had connections to another world, which they were very uncomfortable with, and they didn't know how to deal with me. So they decided to see if they. I mean, my own attorney, who considered that I was guilty anyway at the time, and those were completely trumped up charges that we were brought up on. That day there were no actual drugs except what they had planted there. What else they found was useless. So what happened was that they dragged us through this appalling thing. They confiscated my passport, and by the one's great silver lining was Paul McCartney rung at the Hilton Hotel where we'd taken refuge, Brian Jones and I. And he said, they're going to try and arrest you again. So I'm sending my car and my driver to pick you up and your luggage. You're coming to stay with me. And if they want to arrest you, they'll have to arrest me as well. And, McCartney, MBE, the Beatles, with the power of the Beatles was like, they would think twice about it. So I lived several weeks with Paul McCartney and, worked with the Beatles and, because the circumstances made me a protege of the band, as it were. And so it was a very enriching experience. But on the other hand, I lost a lot of my reputation, and due to the slanderous accusation, which in the eyes of the straight world were not was not a very good publicity.
Right.
And I didn't get to do the film. So it was a terrible, my career was really in a slump. And unfortunately, on the 30th of October 1967, when I showed up for our jury trial, they came up to me and said, "Oh, they're dropping all charges against you." So I rushed up to Brian Jones and I said, "They're dropping all charges, so we're home free and we can sue the bastards." But Brian Jones had been so brainwashed by his legal team that he said, "No, I'm pleading guilty." I said, "Are you mad? I mean, we've won the case. If they're dropping it against me, that means there's no charges against you." He stupidly didn't listen, sadly, I should say, as well. And, he had some bizarre idea that he would somehow atone for God knows what kind of sins towards his parents or something. It was an idiotic move because it was the first nail in his coffin. And by that time, he had less than 2 years to live. And to cope with all the stress and all that stuff, he'd started to take the very wrong kind of prescription medicine. And it destroyed his health. It destroyed all his abilities. And eventually, he died in these tragic and very sordid circumstances. And we're not going to go into that, but it was a terrible, terrible blow because losing first Brian Jones and then, my beloved Sharon Tate, because I had this passionate love of Sharon Tate. We hung out in Rome and had marvelous times together and so on. And then after she did that film, she went back to America and was murdered. And it was, in the same summer. Yeah. It was just the worst kind of thing. I was really devastated by those two deaths, It was horrifying. So as a result, I ended up wanting to go. Well, I had gone, I had left already. A lot of that rock and roll time. I had gone to India in overland at the end. Well, at the end, 67, 68, I was in England, but then I traveled from Rome overland to through Turkey, Persia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, to India. And I went to an ashram in India and was initiated in something called Surat Shabd Yoga, and then wanted to join a pilgrim caravan to go to Kailash, Manasarovar, all those holy lands in Tibet. Trouble was, it was at the height of the Cultural Revolution. There was no way to do it legally. But the sadhu caravans walking, in yogi robes and all that could do it. So I had hatched a scheme whereby I would just wear my yogi robes and have dyed skin and would be a deaf mute and would leave all money, all documents to the place where the caravan began. And, I didn't really care if I was going to live or die on this pilgrimage. But I was keen to do it. And I would have done it had it not been for the fact that the man leading this expedition died just before I got there. And so fate had it that I remembered that in a day's, not very far, so pro flyers, but in the Himalayas, it took an entire day of traveling to get there. Lived Lama Anagarika Govinda, who'd written the book that was my inspiration to embark on that journey to the East in the first place, called The Way of the White Clouds.
Believing Before Seeing, a new bestseller by Candice Bar. Order your copy today.
So I went over to him, and amazingly, when finally he opened the door, so all wonderful details, but I spare them to you, and he opens the door, and I introduced myself, and he said, "Oh, I know exactly who you are." And he swiveled on one foot behind, grabbed a book, flipped it open, and it was a letter from Rainer Maria Rilke to André Gide about my family and about my father, who was then just barely in his teens. And in that letter, so he said, he knew, but it was amazing because it was almost, something so magical as it, and I became his one Tibetology student, and it led me to other adventures, being in Tibetan monasteries and becoming the acolyte of the abbot of Bodhnath Stupa in the Kathmandu Valley, and we organized all kinds of things that I still can't really talk about because they have political implications apart from esoteric ones. But I got in the process a great collection of artifacts and secret knowledge, that was imparted because I was the chosen disciple. So that helped, that gave me the tools to return to the West and do something precise in the field of alchemy, which was I wanted to publish a facsimile of the Splendor Solis manuscript. Nobody had ever thought, it's been done now, but at the time nobody had thought of doing it. So I enlisted the help of a man who was a friend of the family, a very famous art book publisher, Albert Skira. And I then met Derek Turner, who was the keeper of manuscripts at the British Museum, where the British Library at the time was housed. And under his wing, I was able to, explore and actually hold these manuscripts in my hands and prepare this thing. And he sent me to Thames and Hudson. They said, oh, before we do this other thing, which will take some time to coordinate, we have an assignment for you if you will take it, which is we're doing a series called Art and Imagination, and we'd love you to do the alchemy book. Well, I jumped at it, although it was a very small, it was a commission. It wasn't for they paid a flat fee, but I didn't care because it gave me the entree to all the great research libraries across Europe. And needless to say, I spent far more than I was ever going to make on that book, which sold extremely well. But I didn't, the royalties were vested in them. But it gave me I was able thus to go to the Vatican Library. And being a pretty boy, there was the regent of the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana was a wonderful Belgian man, Monseigneur Ruiscard, who loved, certain, and he said, "Oh, I'll waive those regulations for you." And so I got a really privileged treatment. I was able to examine hundreds of things, which would have taken hundreds of days to do. And I still went there every day for, a couple of months at least, every morning to the day I was there, the minute they opened, and left, at the moment, and it was closed in the early afternoon, so that was the end of it. You had to go the next day, but it was and their filing system was really primitive. There was no computers, nothing like that. You had to really rely on a combination of detective work and some sense of what things were going to look like. And so it was like shooting fish somewhere with blindfolded and hoping that you hit something. And I did. I found some amazing material, some extraordinary material, and that made the cover of that book, Alchemy is Secret Art. And then Thames and Hudson asked me to do another book, which was The Golden Game, which is almost unfindable. It commands very high prices, which was eventually published. It took 10 years between signing the contract and this book coming out. And I lived half the year on a private island in Sri Lanka, which I restored this palatial dwelling that a man called Count de Moni Talvan had built. And they completely messed it up. Sadly, I couldn't buy it because the owners wanted some money paid under the table in England. And not only did you have to buy at an official price in Sri Lankan rupees, but if any wind of that transaction, of that illegal transaction, caught, it would be fully licensed to jail you, fine you, and confiscate the whole property. So it was not feasible to do it. And so I lost it after 10 years. And it was a bit of a nightmare. But on the other hand, if I had that place, I might never have ever returned to the West at all. And there was so much more awaiting, so many more experiences and wonderful things that happened henceforth into the 80s and the 90s and onwards, to now.
How long have you been in Malibu for?
36 years this year.
Okay. And then I know you have a castle in Italy, correct?
Yes, the castle was when my father was the head of the French Academy in Rome, 16 years. Nobody ever stayed that long, but he did, and under very special circumstances. And he didn't think his tenure would last that long, so he was looking for a place large enough to have, because he always liked very big places, and he wanted to have a place to have a studio, and the castle, he found it pretty soon, but the owners didn't want to sell. So they looked at 60 properties across the whole of Italy, the road from south to north, without finding a better solution. And in the end, in 1970, the owner changed her mind. She sold it to my father. And when I first went there, I was horrified because it was a real mess. It was gigantic, full of in very bad shape. And my father was very used to restoring these massive buildings and so on. I had a professional team. And he waved the magic wand and in 3 years turned it into a magnificent space. And then only to discover that the summers there were not suitable to his health. So he was ordered by the doctor to go to Switzerland, or in the Alps anyway. And so he went and he found this equally gigantic wooden place called the Grand Chalet in Rossinière, which is a historical monument, 112 windows, and that's where he built a custom-made studio. And predictably, having started work, he never really returned for any length of time to live in at the castle in Italy. He owned it, but he didn't go there.
Mm.
So at one point he was hoping that I would go there, and it seemed fairly unlikely. And I would go there every once in a while. It was rather wonderful, but I didn't. When my father died in 2001, Italian or people who lived, friends in Italy, not necessarily all Italian, but they all said, "You're a criminal if you don't spend more time here, because it's such a magical place." So we started spending a lot more time, and it grew to almost half the year there, practically. And at the moment, I tend to spend even more, to spend almost more time there than I do in Malibu. Then came the pandemic, and then when the pandemic occurred, on the other hand, I couldn't move. So I ended up never leaving my Malibu abode, where I have a marvelous library and I have great instruments as well. So I have my music, and I have, and I'm right on the beach, in this amazing place, and it's a unique location. At the time we said we didn't. There's unfortunately construction on this road. A couple of houses are being built at great expense, and since it's a very narrow beach road, it's always blocked, and there's too much noise. That's why we didn't want to have anybody here.
Yeah, I know Malibu, and it is one way in, one way out kind of deal.
Yes, and now it's been with the winter and the spring we had, it's been particularly bad with everything that's it can take 2 hours to get here if you take PCH.
When is the next time you're going back to the castle?
I leave here on the 30th of May.
Okay. And how long are you staying for?
No, I'm probably not coming back for the rest of the year, because I've got, I promised my sister to spend Christmas in Switzerland. There's always a great party, and I hadn't done it since my father had died. I was always reluctant to go there, but I did finally concede last year and went for Christmas. And now my sister is very keen on getting a family reunion going. So I've sort of more or less committed to doing that. Then I'll probably come back and leave again, because I have a tour of India in the works. In other words, not a tourist tour, no, it's a celebrity meet and greet thing across, going to see, and they're going to film me and all that kind of thing. So that's probably in the cards. I shot this film called The Shining Blood, where I was on both sides of the camera in we had a hiatus. We started shooting on around Thanksgiving of '91. Near there's a place called Eden, Arizona, which used to have this magnificent place called Indian Hot Springs.
Yeah.
And it has these marvelous, that's where they celebrated the end of World War One.
Oh, wow.
It's got this very old hotel that used to have, it had, unfortunately, the place burnt down. I don't know if it was arson or what. But for many years, I was the president of that corporation. And we were going to do something fabulous. And then my erstwhile partner died, and many things happened and that this dream didn't take place. But, it fell onto hard times. The property is still, there's still a ranch there and all that, and cotton fields and so on. But that beautiful building is gone.
Thank you for taking the time. I'm going to have you on again, probably many times, because you have a lot of information. But it's interesting. I really love it. I wish I could have been at the house because I wanted to see all the books and everything.
But it's more. You should look it up on the internet. It's an amazing spot. I mean, just being there is extraordinary because everything from the floor to the furniture to everything is painted. Floor and ceiling, walls, everything.
I will look it up.
And it's called the hieroglyph of the human soul. And it really has. It's like a vision instrument. And true vision, we're talking about. We're not talking about some hallucination. We're talking about the kind of things that I learned about when I was buried, half under the ground in this chamber where instructions were given, where you can actually visualize things. Well, this art form, which is non-illustration, which is sheer inspiration and manifestation of inspiration in a beautiful way. It's not a concept. It's not anything. The artist himself is manifesting it from what I term the absolute elsewhereness of being, and it's just sensational. And there's a lot of things therein which allow ingress into another dimension of being without taking any kind of drugs, without any kind of artificial means. It's just that you are then plugged into something else.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for taking the time.
You're welcome. I enjoyed talking to you very much.
Thank you very much. We will have you on again for sure. Thank you everyone for listening and watching Luxe Life. Be sure to subscribe and we will see you all again next week. Bye everybody.